My grandfather inquired, "Sweetheart, how come you showed up in a rented car? What happened to the Lexus I purchased for you?" My mother cut in sharply before I could respond, declaring, "She has no use for it. Her sister drives it these days." Grandfather fell silent, an eerie, unsettling silence. What he did afterward left everyone in the room paralyzed and filled me with immense pride to carry his blood. It was meant to be an ordinary family get-together. Grandfather's 70th birthday, a significant occasion. He hadn't requested anything extravagant. He simply wished for all of us gathered in one place. So the party took place at his home, the very house he'd occupied since long before my birth. My parents arrived, my sister Danielle with her boyfriend. Even my uncle and his whole crew flew in especially. Everyone acted as though it were the event of the year, beaming, embracing, pretending the past 12 months of backstabbing gossip had never happened. I got there several hours later than the rest. I'd been tied up with a final exam and a deadline, so I drove directly from campus. The moment I pulled into the driveway in that grimy silver rental, I already felt like an outsider. Danielle's boyfriend had parked his Mercedes right in front. Dad's Highlander took a prime spot. Mom still drove her RAV4, and there I was rattling up in a beat-up Nissan that shuddered every time it stopped. Before I could even climb out, I noticed the upstairs curtains twitch. Grandfather had been waiting and watching. Naturally, the front door swung open before my foot hit the porch. "How come you're in a rental? Where's the Lexus I bought you?" I went rigid. I knew that question was inevitable. I'd only hoped it wouldn't be the very first thing he said. From somewhere behind him, my mother answered for me. "She doesn't need it. Her sister uses it now." Just like that, as if the car had simply changed owners by some unspoken family rule. No conversation, no heads up. I said nothing. I should have, but the words wouldn't come. Grandfather studied me for a long, heavy moment, then turned and walked away. Not into the living room, not toward the kitchen. He climbed the stairs without a sound, as though a switch inside him had flipped off. The atmosphere inside felt poisoned. Danielle wouldn't even glance in my direction. Mom shoved a lukewarm plate into my hands like she was granting me charity. Dad stayed out back tending the grill, refusing to meet my eyes. The entire evening consisted of forced chit-chat, flipping through old albums, and the hollow laughter people used to paper over shame. Grandfather barely spoke. He occupied the head of the table, picking at his food, mainly observing, watching all of us, watching them, watching me. At one point I caught him staring at Mom, then Danielle, then down at his plate as if he were assembling a puzzle in his mind. I assumed he'd decided to let it go. I thought the matter was closed. The following morning I woke to the garage door grinding open, loud and intentional, as if he wanted the entire household to hear. He'd summoned a locksmith and timed it perfectly. Everyone was already gathered in the kitchen for breakfast when he stepped in and announced, "You'll want to come outside for this. Especially you, Danielle." She trailed after him wearing that permanent smug expression that says consequences are for other people. But the instant she spotted the locksmith working on the Lexus, the smirk vanished. Grandfather turned to me and pressed the keys into my palm. "Go grab your stuff. I'm taking you to breakfast. We need to talk." I couldn't move. I just stared at my mother, who stood rooted to the spot. Danielle looked as if she'd been struck. Dad never even bothered to see what the commotion was. Nobody yet understood the full scope of what Grandfather had in motion, but it was already irreversible. He didn't speak during the drive. He simply instructed me to follow him in the Lexus, and I obeyed, clutching the wheel as though the car might evaporate if I loosened my grip. We ended up at a little hole-in-the-wall diner he'd patronized since before my parents ever met. The staff greeted him by name, delivered his regular order without asking, and set a steaming hot chocolate in front of me the way they had since I was small. He left his coffee untouched. He didn't open the menu. He just gazed at the Formica tabletop for a while before asking how long ago they had taken the car from me. I spilled everything. 2 months after he gave it to me, Mom insisted Danielle required it more because she had a job and I wasn't contributing. Danielle agreed it was only fair. Dad stayed mute. They made it all sound perfectly logical, and I went along because I hated confrontation. Grandfather listened without a single interruption. When I finished, he asked a question I never saw coming. "And the money, did you ever receive any of it?" I slid through my veins. I asked what money he meant. He drew his phone from his pocket and showed me a transfer confirmation. $10,000 sent last year, intended to help with school because he knew my parents had reneged on their promise to cover tuition. I stared at the screen, stunned. I had never seen a penny. He watched my reaction, nodded once as though my face confirmed what he already suspected, then revealed he had already checked my university account. Not one payment had been made in my name. Danielle's bills, yes. Mine, never. He had quietly settled the outstanding balance himself months earlier, believing his money had gone where he directed it. His anger wasn't loud. It was vast and quiet, the kind that makes the air hard to breathe. Then he explained how he discovered the car situation. The dealership phoned about routine maintenance and offhandedly mentioned the primary driver had been switched. Danielle's boyfriend had serviced it twice. Mom had personally signed the paperwork. Grandfather said he let it fester a few days before digging further. My bank records, tuition payments, even the monthly allowance he'd arranged since my freshman year. All of it diverted months ago into an account controlled by my mother. By the time he finished, the waitress had topped off his cold coffee twice. At last, he met my eyes and said words I will carry forever. Money I can replace. I cannot fix people who believe it's acceptable to rob my granddaughter. After breakfast, he told me to follow him once more. We returned to the house, but he halted in the driveway instead of pulling in. My family lingered on the porch, acting as if nothing had changed. Danielle scrolled her phone. Mom looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her. Grandfather summoned them all closer. His voice was steady, almost gentle. Danielle, hand over the raw of 4 keys. She went still. Mom started to protest, but he lifted one hand and she fell silent. He repeated himself. Danielle dug through her bag and eventually dropped the keys into his palm. Then he instructed Mom to fetch the house keys. She gaped at him as though he'd spoken in tongues. She didn't budge at first, but he simply waited, and the weight of that silence forced her to obey. She placed them in his hand without meeting his eyes. He turned to me next. You're staying here tonight. They can sort out their own arrangements. I will not shelter liars under my roof. The air turned to glass. Nobody argued. Nobody even tried. For the first time I could remember, my family had nothing to say. My parents and Danielle didn't leave immediately. They hovered on the porch like lost souls, unsure whether this was real or just theatrical. But grandfather didn't bluff. He let them marinate in their discomfort. Inside, he worked. He had spread financial statements, legal folders, and bank printouts across the dining table. What I once dismissed as old man paperwork now looked like ammunition. He said nothing for hours, just turned pages and marked passages with a fat red marker. Finally, without raising his head, he told me to sit. He pushed a folder my way. Inside were records of every monthly deposit he'd sent for my food, books, gas, spending, every one processed in my name. I had never seen a dime. Next came printouts of emails he'd sent Mom over the years, checking whether I'd received the support, whether the car was running smoothly, whether I needed anything more. Her replies were always cheerful, always reassuring him everything was wonderful. Meanwhile, I survived on instant noodles and 3-mile walks to class. He tapped another folder. This one cut deeper. Utility statements, credit card charges, transfers from my parents' accounts into Danielle's. The pattern was blatant. Grandfather's money had been laundered into Danielle's tuition, her lifestyle, her rent, even the failed boutique her boyfriend sank 6 months earlier. Then came screenshots of Danielle's group chats, bragging about snatching the Lexus from the dull sister, laughing that Mom could handle Grandpa so he'd never suspect. I couldn't speak. The humiliation burned worse than the anger. They hadn't even pretended to hide it from one another. They genuinely believed I'd never know. Grandfather's only comment, people reveal their true character the moment they think no one will ever make them answer for it. He rose, told me to stay put, walked to the door, and called them all back inside. Chairs scraped on the porch, footsteps shuffled, but they entered. My parents sat like defendants awaiting verdict. Danielle refused a chair, arms folded, leaning against the wall as if she were already bored. Grandfather laid the folders in the center of the table. No yelling, no theatrics, just evidence. He walked them through the rerouted accounts, the forged authorizations, the stolen allowances. He read Danielle's texts aloud. He listed every expense intended for me that had funded their lives instead. When he finished, he looked at the 3 of them and said, "Effective immediately, you are cut off, all of you." Mom stammered that it wasn't malicious, just a misunderstanding. Dad remained mute. Danielle gave a bitter laugh and asked if he was truly choosing me over his real family. Grandfather regarded her as though she were a stranger not worth acknowledging. Then he delivered the next blow. The Lexus is only the beginning. I'm transferring ownership of this house. It's in my name. If you doubt me, the paperwork will be finalized next week. That broke Mom. She began begging, voice trembling on the edge of hysteria, reminding him this was the home she grew up in, the home he'd promised would one day be hers. He replied that he never promised it to thieves. Almost casually, he added to me, "You'll stay in the guest room as long as you need." Danielle stormed out first, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Dad followed without a word. Mom lingered longest, probably realizing she was watching her entire future dissolve. She whispered they had nowhere to go. Grandfather told her that was no longer his concern. 10 minutes later they were gone, the house ringing with the silence they left behind. When the door closed, Grandfather sat heavily in his chair. He looked drained but cleansed, as if he'd finally scrubbed away years of rot. "You're not the crazy one," he told me. "You're not weak. They only convinced you that you were. Now we set it right." The first text arrived the next morning from Mom, "You've humiliated us." I stared at it, thumb hovering, but sent nothing back. 10 minutes later, "Danielle, you think you've won? You're nothing without him." Grandfather saw the messages, told me to ignore them. "People like that only scream when they lose power," he said. He was correct, but I never anticipated their next move. By noon, my phone exploded with notifications from friends, acquaintances, even near strangers. Screenshots flooded in. Danielle had posted a performance on Instagram. Black and white photo of herself on a dingy motel bed, mascara tracks artfully streaked. The caption was a calculated masterpiece of victimhood, claiming her own sister had brainwashed their frail grandfather into stripping the family bare, that I was unstable, that I'd weaponized his grief over Grandma's death. She painted me jealous, vindictive, dangerous. The comments overflowed with sympathy, offers of couches, strangers branding me a monster, old classmates claiming they always sensed my mean streak. Danielle liked every single one. I felt reality tilting. I knew the truth, but online truth is irrelevant. Only the better story matters. And Danielle had always been the better actress. I showed Grandfather the post. He read it in silence, then made one phone call. 20 minutes later, a woman in a charcoal blazer arrived. June, his attorney. He was done sitting idle. 2 days after the Instagram spectacle, a process server appeared with a thick envelope. My parents were petitioning to have Grandfather declared incompetent, alleging I had manipulated a vulnerable elder into reckless decisions that harmed his true family. They sought full guardianship of him and every asset he owned. Grandfather didn't flinch. "Let them try," he said. He handed June every document, every screenshot, every incriminating text. Then he added, "Include the revised inheritance as well." June hesitated. He nodded firmly. "Tell them I've rewritten the will. They inherit nothing." My stomach knotted. I hadn't wanted to ask, but he answered anyway. "You're my sole heir now, Nancy." It didn't feel like winning. It felt like inheriting a battlefield. That night he knocked on my door holding an old cigar box. Inside, photographs, handwritten letters, faded receipts, small mementos. He told me it was time I understood the full story. Then he revealed something that rewrote my entire childhood. When I was an infant, I nearly died of pneumonia. Hospital bills piled up. Grandfather and Grandma covered them without hesitation. What I never knew, my parents had lied, claiming I had no insurance and the hospital demanded immediate cash. They handed over nearly $10,000. Years later, Grandfather discovered the hospital never billed them. The stay had been fully covered. When he confronted my parents about the missing money, they admitted they'd spent it on a Cancun vacation. He had buried the truth to preserve the family. Now he saw that mercy had only postponed the inevitable. I clutched the box, tears falling onto the lid. He rested a hand on my shoulder. "They've been stealing pieces of your life since the day you were born. I should have ended it sooner." That night I finally slept without dread. But I knew in my bones the fight wasn't finished. People who have been disinherited rarely vanish quietly. The next morning felt charged, like the air before lightning. Grandfather left early on errands, which I now recognized as strategic moves. Around 10, June returned with a fortress of paperwork. She reviewed every clause. Accounts formerly accessible to Mom or Danielle were now locked or redirected solely to me. The house was placed in an ironclad trust with me as the only beneficiary. The will was updated, signed, witnessed, notarized, irrevocable. I waited for triumph, but what came was bone-deep relief, as if a chokehold had finally loosened. As June packed her briefcase, Grandfather asked her to produce one last item, a sealed envelope addressed to Danielle. Something she needed to read alone, he said. Not yet, not in front of an audience, but soon. And when she did, she would finally comprehend why this had to happen. June tucked it away. For the first time that day, grandfather looked almost sorrowful. By evening, the news had spread, likely courtesy of my father. My phone buzzed nonstop. Shock, gossip, questions about disownment and lost houses. Then, just after 7, Danielle appeared alone. I watched from the window as she sat in her car for a full 15 minutes before climbing the steps and knocking. Grandfather answered but didn't let her cross the threshold. He stepped onto the porch and closed the door. I couldn't hear them, but I saw her gesturing wildly, pleading. He remained calm, simply handed her the envelope and spoke a few quiet words. She snatched it, spun on her heel, and left. 2 hours later, a text from her. Did you know about all of it? Then another, about your real dad. My heart stopped. I carried the phone to grandfather. He read the messages, exhaled slowly, and nodded. There's one more thing, Nancy. He sat me down and told me the secret he'd guarded for over 20 years. Before I was born, my mother had a brief affair. She became pregnant and passed the child off as my father's. No one suspected, until years later an insurance form flagged incompatible blood types. Grandfather quietly ordered DNA tests. Twice. The results were conclusive. I was not my legal father's biological daughter. He confronted Mom. She collapsed, confessed, and begged him never to tell a soul, especially me. She claimed the truth would shatter the family. So he carried it alone. The letter to Danielle had contained not only the revised will but the DNA results and the full story. I sat reeling, every memory rearranging itself. Why I was always the odd one out, why affection felt rationed, why I never quite fit. I wasn't merely the unfavored daughter. I was the living proof of betrayal they'd been forced to raise. Grandfather looked straight into my eyes. Blood doesn't make you my granddaughter. Loyalty does, and you, Nancy, been loyal since the day you drew breath. I cried then, ugly and loud, and he held me like he had when I was small and the world still made sense. The following morning, the knock came again. I opened the door to find all 3 of them, Mom, Dad, Danielle, standing united like they still belonged. They brushed past me without invitation. Danielle looked exhausted, Mom haggard, Dad unshaven. For one fleeting second, I hoped they had come to apologize. They hadn't. Danielle waved the letter. You knew, didn't you? You knew you aren't even really one of us. Mom jumped in, claiming her affair had been a mistake, that hiding it had protected everyone, that I should be grateful they raised me as their own. Dad finally spoke, urging me to step away, give grandfather space, let tempers cool, insisting this was all temporary, that grandfather would come to his senses. Danielle sneered that if I had any decency, I'd convince him to restore their inheritance, that it was wrong to take the house that was rightfully theirs. That was the moment grandfather walked in. He had heard every word. He looked at them and said only, "Get out of my house." The shouting began, accusations that I had poisoned his mind, tears from Mom, claims from Dad that I was exploiting a grieving old man. Then grandfather turned to me and asked quietly, "Do you want them gone for good? Say the word and I file eviction papers today. They'll never set foot here again. The inheritance becomes untouchable. I'll have them trespassed if they drive past the mailbox." For one heartbeat, I wanted to say yes. After every theft, every lie, every time they made me feel worthless, it would have been justice. Instead, I heard my own voice say, "Don't." Not completely. Grandfather's eyebrows lifted in surprise. I continued, "Let them stay until the end of the year. After that, they're on their own, no money, no help, no more chances. Just time to find their feet." Danielle scoffed that it was pity. I didn't dignify it with a response. Grandfather simply nodded, accepting my decision. They offered no thanks. They filed out in heavy silence and drove away. That night, grandfather and I sat on the back porch watching the stars come out. He was quiet a long time. Then he raised his mug of tea toward mine. "You just did something I couldn't bring myself to do. You showed them mercy they never once showed you. That makes you the strongest person in this family, Nancy, stronger than any of them will ever be." He clinked his mug against mine, and in that small sound I heard the future settling into place. The family I was born into shattered into pieces, but I didn't break with it. For the first time I could remember, I stood exactly where I was always meant to be, beside the one person whose love had never depended on a blood test, holding the keys to a life that was finally, undeniably mine.